event welcoming the stranger, the need for alternatives to detention. My name is Mia and I'm the Executive Director of re-traumatising, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. Those of you who don't know us, we work to promote and protect human rights in the UK, drawing on Jewish values and Jewish experience. We work within the UK's Jewish community by building support for human rights values amongst British Jews, and in wider community by bringing the authority of Jewish perspective on issues that resonate with Jewish experience. Our work on detention, on immigration detention, is probably one of our oldest pieces of work that traces back more than 10 years. And it stems from the idea that we believe that the British public, as much as the Jewish community, have an important stake in maintaining a domestic protection system for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Throughout history, the ability to seek refuge has been essential for Jewish survival. The horrors of the Holocaust led to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was co-drafted by our namesake, and the Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention. Our campaigning on immigration detention includes two main objectives: calling for a time limit on immigration detention, and for the UK government to explore more practical and compassionate alternatives to detention, as the current system is just doesn't work. I think the best definition for the broken system that we have was introduced in 2015, when a cross-party report describes the UK immigration detention system as expensive, ineffective, and unjust. And I think there were two additional words that were missing: cruel and inhumane. Today, on the 21st of October, we celebrate the Jewish festival of Sukkot, known as Tabernacles, when we often reflect on the importance of welcoming the stranger and providing shelter for everyone, as we are reminded that we too were once refugees, and we too once sought safety and a welcoming place. In the 1940s, close to 30 million Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany sought refuge in the UK. Instead, they were classified as enemy aliens and put in immigration internment camps. Today, immigration detention still exists and is proven to be extremely harmful to refugees, especially women, LGBTQI plus refugees, and other vulnerable groups seeking safety, impacting their physical and mental well-being. There is no limit on immigration detention in the UK, meaning that refugees are often locked up for weeks and months to end, with no idea when they will be released. I'm reminded by the powerful words of Suleiman, who in 2015 reflected that the difference between prison and detention is that in prison you get to count the days down, while in immigration detention you count the days up and up and up. But there are other ways. Community-based alternatives to detention are more humane, more effective, and practical measures to reduce the use of immigration detention. So in tonight's event, we will hear about the Jewish experience of internment 80 years ago, and why and how the UK today can make positive changes to its current system of immigration detention. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for this evening, who will give us an overview of the history of detention, Jewish internment 80 years ago, and the challenges facing some of the most marginalized in our community, and the compassionate solutions available. Our first speaker will be my colleague, Wojciech Jerzberska. Wojciech is re-traumatising's communications manager and leads our Safe Routes and immigration detention work. Wojciech holds a BA in religion, philosophy, and ethics, and an MA in human rights. She's also the country coordinator in Central Europe at Amnesty International UK, and has previously hosted a podcast for the International Women's Initiative. After Wojciech, we will have Emma Webb. Emma is the campaigns manager at Rainbow Migration, where they lead on the No Pride in Detention campaign to end the immigration detention of LGBTQI plus people. They previously worked in campaigning roles at St. Mungo's, Age UK, and Parkinson's UK. And Jonathan Ellis, a good friend of re-traumatising. who leads the Detention Forum, a network of over 50 NGOs, of which René Cassin is also a member, challenging the use of immigration detention in the UK, and the big organizing project at Freedom from Torture. Previously, he led campaigns for British Red Cross, Oxfam, the Refugee Council, and Action on Empathy Homes. He has also stood twice as a parliamentary candidate in the UK. Jonathan has developed a distinctive approach to campaigning over 25 years, which he uses as a campaigner, teacher, and catalyst. Woodzia, Emma, and Jonathan will each speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will open the conversation up for questions from the audience using the Q&A function on your screen. And just finally, before I pass it over to Woodzia, just a reminder that this event is being recorded. So Woodzia.
Great, I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully this works. Can everyone see that? Cool. So let me just make this bigger. Great. I've just realized I can't see my notes. I'm gonna keep it like this, that's all right. So welcome to this event, and I'll be speaking on the Jewish experience of detention during World War II. So firstly, the experience of seeking refuge and safety is not alien to many members of the Jewish community. In their journeys, they are seeking countries where they would be treated with dignity and compassion, not suspicion, punishment, and cruelty. This was certainly the case for approximately 30,000 German, Austrian, and Czechoslovakian refugees, many of them who were Jewish, who sought the refuge in the UK during the early 1940s. But they were classed as friendly enemy aliens and were therefore interned on the Isle of Man. And you can see many pictures on the screen here of Jewish refugees being interned and shuffled towards the detention camps. Even German nationals who had lived in Britain for decades were also arrested, and those who had passports from the Axis powers as well. In May 1940, the British government under Winston Churchill first decreed that the internment of male enemy aliens became between the ages of 16 and 60, and Churchill then issued the notorious order to collar the lot. And this ultimately caused the internment of some 27,000 people, including many who had been found by a tribunal to be genuine refugees. And each of those interned have a story, and a story of a journey seeking sanctuary and refuge. And since joining René Cassin, I have had the privilege of learning some of those stories. And the first example I'm going to give you is of Fritz Lustig. And here you can see an image on the left of Fritz later on in life, and to the right, whilst he was freed from detention. So Fritz was a young German Jew from Berlin who arrived in England mid-April 1939 to escape Nazi terror. And upon arriving in the UK, Fritz faced a growingly hostility towards Germans. And a year after arriving to the UK and whilst at school, Fritz was arrested and transported to the Isle of Man for internment. And while recalling the story to René Cassin members, Fritz remembers being amused that he was treated as a criminal who needed to be prevented from trying to escape. And the experience of being interned on the Isle of Man was one of hostility that he remembers, and internees were constantly being watched. Their communication with the outside world was very restricted, and Fritz never felt free as there was barbed wire around the whole internment camp. And Fritz's internment was relatively short. After 3 months, like many other friendly enemy aliens, he was offered the opportunity to join the British Army, firstly as a CELO player and later as a listener, where he used his knowledge of the German language to gather all his information from German and Austrian prisoners of war. But despite his experience and internment, Fritz went on to have a family and build a life in the UK, and he became a British national in May 1947. And you can actually hear more about Fritz's experience of internment through Fritz himself on our René Cassin YouTube channel, which we'll have a link to at the end. But it wasn't also only men who were interned on the Isle of Man. There were also separate female barracks, and a family one. And one of those females interned was Margot, which I had the pleasure of Margot's daughter telling me her story. And you can see to the left here, this is Margot. This is her passport in the Third Reich. This is her daughter visiting the house that she was in. And this is the Home Office letter that she received that she was an enemy alien that had to be interned. So Margot grew up in Nazi Germany, born in 1920, and she managed to escape the Third Reich just before the war broke out in early July 1939. And she was sponsored to work as a nurse in St. James's Hospital in Leeds. And this sponsorship scheme, Margot came to require sponsors who had to pay £50, which is nowadays equivalent to £2,500 for the refugees to show that they were not a burden to the state. And Margot was sponsored by a Quaker woman who she had never met, but she showed compassion to Margot. And shortly after the war broke out, Margot was classified as a friendly, as an enemy alien, because the hospital she was working at was a military hospital. And she wasn't allowed to stay there and had to go somewhere else, leaving behind her friends and the life that she had built in Leeds. And in May 1940, she was interned on the Isle of Man, and she spent 15 months there before her case came up to the tribunal. And she was freed straight away, and she went back to St. James's in Leeds. And again, you can hear the story of Margot and through Diana, which is her daughter, on our YouTube channel as well. But during all of this, it's really important to note that Jewish experiences of detentions were far more compassionate than those of the contemporary detention centers today. And I'll show you the media reports, kind of the differences of the media between then and now as well. You can see here that, yes, they're talking about the problem of refugees, but now media is talking more about swarms and pointing refugees in a very, very hostile light. So today, immigration detention centers offer female detainees far less opportunity over their own lives and the women interned on the Isle of Man that they were. But whilst Fritz's and Margot's experiences of internment were relatively okay, it isn't always the case. And in one really horrifying safeguarding breach, a Jewish girl was forced to share a double bed with a Nazi loyalist for quite a few months. And a Jewish internee named Erna Nalki wrote to the Russian Journal on the misery of the living quarters. And she said that to me and many other women who had suffered under the Nazi regime in Germany as Jews or political opponents, it is difficult to understand that Nazis who are still in the camp are able to torture those that they choose as their victims. And these conditions expose the British government inability then, and very much like today, to distinguish refugees from the posing genuine potential threats to national security. And they also reveal a tendency to treat all foreigners with suspicion as an intrinsic otherness with little care for mental and physical well-being. And an instance of this was upon arrival on the island, detainees were assigned prison numbers, which created intense fear and failed to recognize or to be sensitive to their experiences as victims of the Nazis. And today's government repeats really similar failures by detaining female asylum seekers and males who have been victims of sexual trauma or trafficking, for example, and the system routinely re-traumatizes victims of violence and torture. And again, going back to the media portrayals then and now, at the time, both the Parliament and the British media came out against the un-British act of detaining refugees, and especially women and children. And media coverage on internment of refugees framed the policy as an intolerant act, monstrously unjust, and a disrespectful story of the nation. And this reaction came from across the political spectrum, with Conservative MP Major Victor Calzert providing one of the period's most damning critiques of internment, calling its initiation totally un-English and a matter which touches the good name of this country. And Conservative peers were known to raise questions on camp conditions to the Lords during the time when Jewish refugees were being interned. And outside Parliament, a letter from the Times, which notably signatures as E.M. Foster, declared that the Jewish and other refugees from Nazi oppression should not be interned with Nazi sympathizers. And this is not to say that there was no moral panic in the press about the influx of Jewish refugees, which would mean for the preservation of Britishness. But by August 1940, public opinion had really swung sharply against internment, and the government started to reverse its policy. And by campaigning, we can also do that now. So it was really important to note that the policy of interning Jewish refugees was not just in response to fear from enemy aliens, but from the Axis countries, but also in response to a prevalent anti-Jewish refugee attitude starting in the early 30s. And in either case, detention was never the right answer. No fear or hatred should determine how we treat refugees. In the same way today, detention is never the answer for refugees seeking safety in the UK. And our response then, as today, should be one of compassion and dignity. So thank you so much for listening to me. Here is all our media channels that you can see, Fritz's and Margot's stories, if you want to check that out as well. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Woodzia. Emma, if you're happy to go ahead.
Thanks, Mia. Just give me a second to share my screen. Okay, there we go. I hope everyone can see my slides now. They're quite sparse anyway. They're mostly just there to show some quotes from LGBTQI plus people to contextualize the points that I'm making. So yeah, thank you for having me, everyone. My name's Emma and I'm the campaigns manager at Rainbow Migration. At Rainbow Migration, we have over 30 years experience of supporting LGBTQI plus people through the asylum and immigration system. And our vision is a world where LGBTQI plus people can settle safely in the UK and lead fulfilling lives. As you'll be aware, there are still many countries around the world where LGBTQI plus people face violence, abuse, and criminalization. As a result, they have to escape and try to rebuild their lives in safety elsewhere. Some of them come to the UK, expecting to find safety and support here. And although an overwhelming majority of us welcome them, they have to face a distressing, degrading, and dehumanizing asylum system that can be particularly cruel for LGBT people. Proving their sexual orientation or gender identity to the Home Office is extremely difficult, and it often involves revealing intimate details of their lives that they may never have disclosed before. After that, they're often placed in unsafe housing conditions while they wait for their asylum claim to be processed, and some will face immigration detention, where homophobic abuse is rife. That's where we come in there. At Rainbow Migration, we provide specialist legal advice and information to LGBTQI plus people, and we put them in touch with lawyers that might be able to represent them. We also provide practical and well-being support, for instance, helping them to access safe housing and healthcare, and signposting them to other charities. And then last but not least, we take all of the learnings from our frontline support services and we campaign to improve the asylum system, making it fairer and more compassionate for everyone and highlighting the particular issues that LGBTQI plus people face. So I'll be talking mostly about LGBTQI plus detention in this presentation, but for those who might be newer to the topic, I'll just give a very brief overview of immigration detention in the UK first. So essentially, detention is when the government locks people up in detention centres for reasons of immigration control. Those centres are run by private security companies for profit, and they're notorious for their prison-like conditions and lack of safeguards. The UK is the only country in Europe where there's currently no statutory time limit on how long someone can be detained, so people will spend weeks, months, or even years inside. And although detention is often justified as helping the government to remove people from the UK, the vast majority of people who are detained will be released rather than returned. So being detained it's a really traumatic and dehumanizing experience, and it's damaging to anyone's physical and mental health. It's unjust and inhumane and has no place in a compassionate asylum system. And at Rainbow Migration, we want to see an end to all immigration detention in the UK, and we campaign with Jonathan and others as part of Detention Forum for that. However, despite the new government, we feel that the end of detention in the UK is not currently in sight. And while it remains part of our system, we urgently need to limit the harm that it's causing to people. So for us, that means immediately ending the detention of people who cannot be kept safe from harm, like members of the LGBTQI plus community, It means imposing a time limit on detention, so no one can be held indefinitely with no idea when they might be set free. And it means investing in compassionate, community-based alternatives, which Jonathan's going to speak to you about shortly. When it comes to LGBTQI plus people in detention, there's a number of issues that are specific to the community, though. So firstly, LGBTQI plus people who come to the UK because of homophobia or transphobia in their country of origin tend to then find themselves detained alongside people from that same country or from other countries where that's an issue. And that puts them at risk of experiencing the same prejudice all over again in detention. So this quote is from Joel Mordy. He's a prominent Nigerian LGBT activist who was detained in Harmondsworth when he fled to the UK. And he talks about feeling that in detention, there's no escape there from the prejudice and violence that had caused him to flee Nigeria in the first place. Similarly, these words are from Monono. She's a lesbian woman from Malawi who's been detained in Yarlswood multiple times. And the fact that these homophobic attitudes and behaviours are rife within detention centres forces many LGBTQI plus people back into the closet while they're there, which can make them even more isolated in what's already an extremely difficult situation. So in these quotes, Monono's talking about a need to keep her identity secret in case someone else in the detention centre sends word back to Malawi and she's then sent back into danger. Joel, on the other hand, is talking about hiding his sexual orientation to avoid being a target for violence whilst inside detention. But whatever the reason, having to start concealing your identity again after having come so far to seek safety is really difficult. And it can also have a negative effect on people's asylum claims. So for example, if someone is trying to gather evidence for a fresh asylum claim, which requires them to prove their sexual orientation to the Home Office, that's going to be extremely hard to do while simultaneously trying to conceal your sexual orientation in detention. And for those who aren't able to fly under the radar in that way, unfortunately, their time in detention can turn into a nightmare of bullying and harassment, as you can see from these quotes. A third issue that people face is with the staff in detention centres. So the quotes on this slide are from people who tried to seek help from staff with bullying and who didn't receive any support. But we've also heard from people who were taunted and bullied by members of staff themselves, or who had other problems such as staff recording the wrong gender or the wrong pronouns on their documentation. And those of you who followed the Brook House inquiry last year might remember the case discussed in the inquiry report of a gay Moroccan man who was locked up in Brook House. One of the guards was taunting him about his clothing in front of other people in the detention centre, telling him that his clothes made him look gay. And that led to him kind of being outed and bullied by others. And the inquiry found that the guard had done that on purpose to humiliate him, and that they did not, knowing that it would put him in danger. Oh, sorry. Finally, as with others seeking asylum in this country, the conditions in detention can be re-traumatising for LGBTQI plus people. So that applies to both the bullying and abuse I already talked about, where that mirrors experiences that people have fled, but also the very fact of being locked up, which some people will have experienced in their home country. So the quote on this slide is from someone who was arrested and imprisoned in their home country for being a lesbian, then came here seeking safety and found themselves locked up again in a detention centre in the UK. So all of that is why we're leading the No Pride in Detention campaign, which is supported by a coalition of 37 other LGBTQI plus and asylum organisations. The campaign calls for an end to the detention of LGBTQI plus people, for a 28-day time limit, and for investment in compassionate community-based alternatives to detention. As you'll hear from Jonathan, the nature of those schemes mean that they could allow LGBTQI plus people to live safely and with dignity while navigating our asylum and immigration system. If you're not already part of this campaign, please do sign our hand raiser by scanning the QR code on this page. It's a really crucial time for the campaign right now because the government has just commenced a review of its adults at risk in immigration detention policy. Very briefly, that policy recognises that certain groups of people might be at extra risk of harm in detention, and it makes it less likely that they'll be detained. So currently, trans and intersex people are recognised under the policy, but lesbian, gay and bisexual people aren't. So we're going to be really pushing for the risks to the whole LGBTQI plus community to be recognised in the new policy. And if you sign the hand raiser and opt into our emails, then we'll let you know really soon how you can help with that. Similarly, if you're part of a group or an organization who would like to join the campaign coalition, just drop us an email on that email address on the slide, and we'd love to hear from you and get you signed up. But yeah, that's it from me. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Jonathan to talk about alternatives.
Emma, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and always a pleasure to support Mia and her team. I'm also going to share my slides. So just bear with me a second. And I'm going to talk about practical and compassionate alternatives to detention. I think quite sobering, to hear our early presentations from Lucia and from Emma in terms of the sheer horror of detention. And I'm going to talk about practical and compassionate, not just compassionate, but an alternative which has proven to work. So we've already heard compelling testimony in terms of the impact that immigration detention causes. As we've heard, that people can be detained at any time and indefinitely. We do have principles in this country which are referred to as a Hardeal-Singh principles, which are basically that you can only be detained for the purposes of immigration detention if there's a reasonable expectation that you will then be removed from the country. And that's an important principle when we've heard about the harm, as Emma eloquently described, that immigration detention causes. But the most recent statistics that I saw, that 67% of people who are going into immigration detention will then be released back. So we're detaining people for the purpose of immigration, causing huge harm to their physical and mental health, and then they're being released into the community. And if you need any independent analysis of what's happening at the moment, Emma's already referred to the Brook House inquiry, which is a powerful indictment of the system, but also the recent inspection of the Harmondsworth Detention Centre in London by the Chief Inspector of Prisons. And he paints a compelling picture of why we need to change in terms of the chaos that's in that detention centre. But also he points to the fact that around 60% in the case of Harmondsworth of people will then go on to be released. And it kind of begs the question, why are we doing this? Why are we detaining people? Particularly when there is a compassionate and practical alternative, where liberty isn't deprived, where engagement with the immigration process is much higher, where people understand the process that they're engaging with and their options, and it's substantially cheaper. And here in the UK, but also internationally now, there's a growing evidence base of what we mean by these community-based alternatives. In the UK, there's been projects that have been independently funded, such as by Detention Action, for example, and Micro Rainbow up in Leeds. But also, and very interestingly, there have been 2 pilot projects funded by the Home Office, which have given us a glimpse into what a world could look like without the need for immigration detention. And this alternative model is called the case management approach. That's the jargon, isn't it? But the case management approach. But what does it mean? It means taking a kind of 2-approach way to looking at this issue. Yes, if you look at the bottom, providing quality legal support, really, really important. So many people who are trapped in the asylum and immigration system did not receive quality, decent legal support right at the start of the process. So you have a 3-stage model of initial introduction, detailed examination of the person's history and possible way forwards, and then a presentation of viable options on the individual's immigration status. So decent, proper quality legal support. But also, it doesn't just take the legal perspective. It looks at the person as a whole, as an individual, and it looks and listens to their needs in terms of what additional support, and certainly on some of the pilot projects that we have had contact with, it can be incredibly simple things like the individual not having access to a general practitioner, for example, and being unable to meet their basic primary healthcare needs. So this kind of holistic approach, both individual care for the individual, but also quality legal support, and based in the community, not locking people up. And one of the pilot projects funded by the Home Office was the King's Arms Project in Bedfordshire. And they ran a fascinating project, which was then independently reviewed, commissioned by the UNHCR. And I think the evidence from this project is compelling. At the very least, it should make government, and indeed all politicians, just look and see whether there is actually a better, more viable, more compassionate way forward. Of all the people going on to the scheme, and it's important to say that these people weren't in detention, but they were liable to be detained at any time. Of the cohort going into this pilot project, 80%, so what's that, 4 in 5 of people were offered a way to regularize their status. I think that's really quite profound. So these are people who are trapped in the asylum and immigration system, but with proper care, proper support. 4 in 5 were offered a way to regularize their status. None of them were detained, and it was 2/3 less expensive than being in detention. Really, really powerful. And what we're doing at Detention Forum is trying to say to government, both the last government and this new government, is let's look at these pilots. Let's run more of them. Let's look at the learning. And the independent evaluation is really clear of how effective this approach has been, but also the fact that it is cheaper. And at the moment, the government is saying that they don't think there's proof that it's effective or cheaper, as indeed the last government said that when the independent evaluation said quite the contrary. And I'd like to tell you not just about the statistics, but about one incredibly impressive young woman who at Detention Forum, we had the good fortune to hear speak at one of our meetings. And she painted this picture of her life, and she'd been in the UK for several years, where her life had just been put on hold, where she'd been trapped, where she was unable to get permanent status. She was just in this kind of limbo period where she was unable to work. And more than that, she suffered the perennial fear of being detained at any time. And this young woman was able to go on one of the pilot projects, and she was one of those who was offered a way to regularize her status. And just this project and so many others are incredibly powerful proof of the fact that there are so many people who have been let down, who are trapped in the asylum and immigration system, who shouldn't just be discarded, detained, and removed, but they should be listened to and their cases properly addressed. So we do have this alternative model that is compassionate. It's practical. It's actually proven to work. I was really interested talking to our colleagues at the International Detention Coalition recently, which is kind of like the international version of Detention Forum, of how increasingly across the world, more and more people are talking around case management as this compassionate, practical alternative model. It also increases engagement with people with the asylum and immigration system, and it is cheaper. You know, at the very least, it is something that this government should look at to explore how we might be able to develop this model. And in fact, when the UNHCR reported on the 2 Home Office funded pilot projects, their clear recommendation to government, was that this approach should become business as usual at the Home Office. So I think what we need at Detention Forum, working with Rainbow Migration, working with René Cassin, working with all of our members, is to get more people talking about this viable and compassionate approach. You know, and really, I think we could argue that how we treat people at the end of the immigration process is a measure of how civilized we are as a society. And we need to be talking to a variety of groups, of politicians, community groups. You know, we need to be engaging more with the media. We need to be talking to local authorities, devolved nations. We need to be telling people that there is a practical and compassionate alternative. And certainly as the Detention Forum, as Mia said, we're a network of over 50 independent NGOs. We've been working hard to present and advocate, promote this message. You'll find on our website all briefing papers and communication messages. And we're working with volunteer visitor groups, as well as people with lived experience, to actually promote this positive message. Yes, we want to end immigration detention, but we do see that there's a viable evidence base of the need to move towards a compassionate, alternative, community-based alternative to detention. And something which has happened quite recently is our connection with NACOM. the No Accommodation Network, which is one of the most impressive networks, I think, across the country, helping people who are destitute. And these projects very often take a case management approach, the very approach that I explained in the context of detention, providing that holistic support to the individual. And many of these projects now are really seeing themselves as de facto providing an alternative to detention projects. And we just don't have the evidence of, say, 4 pilot projects. We have a huge evidence base across the country of this alternative, practical, compassionate model. So basically, I think we need more people hearing about this alternative vision. We need more people, different people, just talking about it, spreading the word. We need to make the case for a compassionate and yet still practical alternative to immigration detention. You know, why are we locking up so many people, causing them huge harm to their physical and mental health? That deprivation of liberty is a horrendous thing for a society to do to an individual, particularly when there is this practical, cheaper, and more effective community-based alternative. And we very much hope that you'll join us in promoting the urgent need for change. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass you back to Mia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Emma and Wutya. It was a whirlwind journey through 80 years of internment and detention practices here in the UK, often having a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society. I'd now like to welcome our audience to ask Jonathan, Wutya, Emma questions about the work of our respective organizations, any questions you have. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think. I've got a question just to kickstart the process. Jonathan, you said, you know, we need community-based alternatives. And I think just the most recent scheme, for example, of Ukrainians at home has shown that there are actually communities are interested and are engaged. But why is it difficult to translate that compassionate, that practical, that open attitude towards refugees to those who are held in immigration detention? Where do you think it's stuck?
I think it's a great question, and I think both this government and the previous government, this obsession with immigration detention, this desire to cling to it, and yet you'll have reports like the Chief Inspector's report on Harmondsworth, which presents a chaotic system. This is public money used to run a chaotic system, when almost 2/3 of people will then go on to be released. And then we would like these people to be integrated into our society, maybe down the line, and yet we're detaining them at huge, damage to their physical and mental health. And I think we need to find, Mia, calmer ways to engage with politicians. There's this kind of knee-jerk reaction. We need detention. Detention is what any asylum and immigration system needs. And I think we have to find calm and safe spaces to kind of discuss and challenge politicians. With many of the politicians that we've been able to meet recently, it's really interesting that they don't know about this growing evidence base of this community-based alternative, the projects that have been run in this country, the projects that have been run internationally. We're working with the University of Leeds at the moment, just pulling together a distillation of the key evidence there. And I think we have to work with them. And at the very least, we need to work with them on exploring more such pilot projects. Yes, you could argue 2 is a small sample size. When Sir Stephen Shaw did his review of immigration detention, and he looked at the detention estate, and many of the reforms that we began to see came because of what Sir Stephen Shaw said. One of his key reforms was we need to explore alternatives, community-based alternatives to detention. And it was that seminal report that got the previous government doing that. The government committed itself to run 4. We only ran 2. You know, Mia, there's never been a debate in Parliament. There's never been a proper debate in Parliament about the public money that was used to fund a community-based alternative pilot. Why not have that debate? Why not encourage the select committees to do an investigation? You know, we're not saying that this is necessarily the answer, but I tell you one thing, it is definitely the right direction, the right way to go. It gets more engagement, it's cheaper, and it helps people actually work out where they are in the process. So I guess probably for us, Mia, it's less about us shouting, less about signboards, but actually finding those spaces, those opportunities to engage with politicians and others, to talk them through the evidence base and why this is an effective and sustainable way forward.
Thank you, Jonathan. Emma or Wutsia, would you like to add anything to that?
I think the other thing that I would like to add is the fact that we need to engage or have communities be able to help us with alternative detention as well. So, for example, the Jewish community with synagogues also being able to provide and have that space for alternatives to actually take place, or churches, mosques, or that kind of stuff. Because in order to have alternatives to detention work, we need communities to be able to support the work that is happening, which was really shown through the Ukraine scheme. So it's just making sure that it is kept up again, because we know the communities are very interested in helping these refugees. So therefore, we just need to be able to keep up that momentum.
I would just add as well that I think part of the reason why it's not always received in the same way as the kind of asylum and refugee issue is because there's a lot of misunderstanding about detention and the nature of detention and who is detained. As part of our campaign, I do quite a lot of in-person events with people in the LGBTQI plus community in the UK talking about detention. And it's quite an unusual situation in the UK to be able to be locked up and deprived of your liberty, having not committed any kind of crime necessarily. And people often struggle with that and assume that people are being detained because they're dangerous or they've done something illegal or so on, rather than it being a kind of administrative convenience. So I think that there's also just quite a lot of work to be done around kind of raising the public consciousness around detention and educating people about who is being detained and how they're being harmed by it and how different it is to the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Emma, I think the next question is addressed to you. It's actually two questions. To what extent is there flexibility for LGBTQI people seeking asylum in terms of how they explain their identities to the authorities in the hope of being believed? Thinking about how stuck we've got in very rigid, born this way framing of trans experience, for example, which doesn't resonate with lots of people here in the UK and also seems very Western centric.
Yeah, so obviously LGBTQI plus people can choose for themselves how they explain their identities to Home Office officials in the UK, but they do often have trouble being believed, and we're aware that a lot of the Home Office officials will apply kind of stereotypes and Western notions of sexual orientation and gender identity, often like that don't fit the experiences that people have and that people come from. So it can be very difficult if people aren't framing it in the way that a Home Office official might expect for their story to then be accepted and believed.
Thank you. What age are the youngest migrants or refugees and asylum seekers in the detention centers? What about women and children? And would say you mentioned Essexfield, and we used to have Yarlswood as well, but there have been changes in policy. If either of you want to talk through that, just to give an overview of the ages and the groups of people.
I mean, the youngest, I would say, well, there's pregnant women in detention, so you can say the youngest is technically unborn children. But also the fact, well, women for refugee women are really, really pioneering in this, the fact that they managed to reduce in the Legal Migration Act, the fact that women in detention, or pregnant women in detention, can only stay for a max of 72 hours. So that was one of the kind of, although we want to get rid of it completely, because obviously no one should be in detention, but at least that has been recognized within the Legal Migration Act. There's also a report within that women and refugee women did that I'm going to put in the chat about coercion and women's experiences of detention within the UK, especially with them if they were trafficked, or the sexual harassment that they have experienced. So I would definitely say, definitely read that report if you're more interested to figure out the experience of women and children in detention, and follow the work of Women for Refugee Women, because they're really doing great work to really deal and help with that situation.
Thank you. Is there any distinction applied between economic migrants and those coming from escaping war, persecution, and hostilities? And how well, if at all, does the Home Office apply that distinction? Who wants to have a go, Emma? Or does migration come across? Well, actually, no. Probably in the case of LGBTQI people, it's mostly due to persecution. I'm guessing.
Yeah, the people that we work with are fleeing persecution on account of their LGBTQI plus identity. But I saw that Jonathan was unmuting himself, so I don't know if you wanted to step in here.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah, sure, Emma. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a lot about language. I remember working on this issue 25 years ago for Oxfam, and all of the media coverage was around asylum seekers. All the media headlines that Woodsy was talking about was all about we got all these asylum seekers kind of coming through. It almost became a kind of term of abuse, asylum seekers, and now it's been really interesting but quite insidious how that language is now migrants. They're not asylum seekers; they're all migrants, really. And I don't quite know how that's happened, really, I think. And I think we almost need to reclaim the language that the UN would say, anyone's a refugee when they cross an international border, an international boundary, because they're in fear of persecution, and it's why are we referring to people like that as migrants? I think it's really almost trying to kind of desensitize what's actually happening. I know Refugee Council did some analysis of people who are crossing the English Channel in small boats, and 90% of people were coming from, war-affected, refugee-producing countries, right? 90%, 9 in 10, and yet they're all referred to as migrants. Surely the vast majority will be people seeking asylum. I mean, not all of them. Yeah, not all of them, but many will be. But we choose to use the word migrant, really. And I think there's this really important kind of concept, post the Second World War and the international settlement and the 51 Refugee Convention that Mia was talking about. And one of the things that I really take huge heart from is that all of us have the right to seek asylum. It's one of those international rights. And I remember one famous question time when Baroness Varsi, she wasn't, I don't even know if she's a Tory peer anymore, but she was challenged on this issue about bogus asylum seekers. And she gave a brilliant answer. And she said, you can't have a bogus asylum seeker. Everybody has got the right to cross an international boundary and seek protection. They might not get that refugee status, but they have the right to claim. And I think, Lucia was talking about the horrors of the 1930s and 1940s. Maybe we've somewhat lost that international principle that was such a victory in 1951, that people do have the right to travel, the right to claim. Under the Refugee Convention, they don't have to claim in the first country that they come to. It's a question of where they feel safe. And I almost think, Mia, we almost need to kind of reclaim the language, of what it means to seek safety, and it's really difficult for people living in this country. Where would we go? What would we do if we were being persecuted in this country, and trying to see it from the other way, which is incredibly difficult. But I think we need to reclaim the language. There's nothing wrong with being a migrant. I'm a migrant, but I'm not a refugee. There's a real difference there. But people who are seeking asylum, we should cherish that international right, and we should give them the support to make their claim for refugee protection. And I think we should be bold and confident and reclaim that language, and not have this lazy dependency on using the word migrant that somehow just kind of dehumanizes, desensitizes what we're really talking about, which is people fleeing political persecution.
Also, just to add on that, I think the role of media is really massive in that as well, how newspapers portray refugees and migrants, and a lot of the time they confuse the two, and they portray this kind of idea that refugees or coming here from fleeing persecution are migrants that are trying to take our jobs, and all those kind of rhetorics that we all have heard in newspapers. But I think what we can learn from the 1940s as well is a lot of public opinion really shifted, and the media became a bit more positive towards refugees, and that is when the internment ended and it was repealed, and Churchill really regretted making his claim to colour the law. So I think that just really shows such a powerful statement of what the media can do and how public opinion can really shift it, and the power that we will have through campaigning for alternatives to detention to end detention for all people. So I think that's a really powerful thing to really keep in mind, and really hopeful to know that there is something that we can do, and we can change MPs' minds about immigration laws, or especially with detention. So in that way, it kind of keeps us all going to really keep campaigning and to see the end of immigration detention for definite.
Thank you. And I think your comments tie very nicely with David's comment in the Q&A that detention is part of a system of deportation, of keeping people out, and we should really challenge that system and those elements. I think the fact that we have a government now that, Jonathan, like you said, the rule of law, whether it's the 1951 Refugee Convention that the UK is signatory to, or other base fundamental human rights principles, should help in the way the UK addresses fixes its broken asylum system. And I think it's exactly what you said about media. It's about making the case. It's about using communities like the Jewish community that have a story to tell, have quite a powerful story to tell, and making sure that we use that as leverage to make the case for those fundamental principles. I'm conscious of time. I'd like to give each one of you an opportunity for final words before we bring this to a close. So Emma, if there's anything you still want to update us on, call to action, this is the opportunity.
Thanks, Mia. Yeah, my call to action would just be with the ongoing adults at risk review that is kind of about to move into a more public phase. Please do get in touch with your MP about the harms to LGBTQI plus people in detention and the need to include them in that. We'll have a campaign action to enable you to do that on our website sometime soon. If you want to sign up to our hand raiser in the meantime and opt in, then you'll hear all about it. But it really is a great opportunity for us to make some progress on this issue that has been dragging on for a really long time. So if you agreed with anything that I was saying in my presentation, please do get involved with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Mia. I mean, I'm really taken by what Woodsy had said about the lessons of the 1940s, you know, that politicians moved when there was that kind of public feeling. And I think we need to do the same thing. I think we need to get people talking about detention, that we have a broken system, a system that's not working, a system that's causing huge physical and mental harm to people, a system which then 2/3 of people will be released. At the very least, as taxpayers, we could say, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Surely there's a better, more effective, cost-effective way, you know, to do this in a compassionate, caring way. And frankly, we need more voices from different sides of society. And, you know, and evil triumphs, doesn't it, when good men and women do nothing. And we have to step up. We have to talk about this issue. We have to encourage others to talk about it to get the change that Woodsy powerfully described for the 1930s and 1940s. We need to do the same thing now, not give up and keep pushing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Woodsy, what are we going to do, Renik? What is Renik Hassan planning to do?
So I think one of the things that I would advise everyone to read is our alternatives to detention briefing on our website, and write to your MPs using our briefing to really see the key points that they can take in, so they can also be educated on it. to know exactly what's happening, because a lot of the times MPs have never ever stepped foot inside a detention centre, so don't actually know what's happening. So getting that information out to them is really important. The other thing is share stories of your family, of your own experiences. Like we all said, it's such human nature to travel and to migrate and to move around anywhere, and sharing those stories within the media, within your own communities, having these kind of conversations are so important in order to have, and Mia's just shared the briefing in the chat, so do take a look at that. We're going to be having more discussions with MPs. We're part of the detention forum, so we keep having discussions as Renee-Kassan with them, and working with partners like Rainbow Migration with Emma on the No Pride to Detention, but also Women for Refugee Women, and so many other really incredible charities and organisations that we're working towards to really fight to end detention in the UK.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Wootia. Thank you, Emma, for taking the time. It's one of those issues where the solution is so clear. It's the right solution. It's the compassionate solution. It's the cheaper solution, like you said, Jonathan. It's the practical solution. It's the one that is fair in how it treats everyone in our society. And I think certainly we at Renee-Kassan and as part of the Detention Forum are up for the challenge. Thank you very much. Thank you to our participants. We will share links to the Detention Forum, to Rainbow Migration, and recent action that Renee-Kassan has in follow-up emails. And I would just urge you to really sign up to our newsletter, follow the work we do. We will hold this government, as we did the previous government, to account, and urge for changes in our asylum and immigration system. We need, like we all repeated many times, we need to show more compassion. We need to be more welcoming. We need to be more humane. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.